All right, in the last video we talked about how machines using new technology, using the steam engine especially, start to spread everywhere. So we see machines and factories now taking over. Now, most people are still doing agricultural work, but we're starting to see machines and factories taking over all the industrial sphere, how we used to do work. Excuse me. So, well, let's talk about the impact of those things. Now this is the early industrial age. Let's talk about the earliest time for factory life. So we already said this. For most of history, people used to farm. People used to work at home. You'd work seasonally. You'd never really work at night. You know, you would work up maybe before the sun came up and work slightly after the sun went down, but you weren't doing hard physical labor out in the fields in the dark. So most people worked seasonally, never worked at night. But now factories changed everything. Factories don't need to shut down. We're not at light bulbs yet, but eventually light bulbs will be invented. And you can work third shift. Originally, of course, you'd use candles, and factories don't need to shut down. They don't work seasonally. You can work a factory 12 months out of the year, so they could work constantly. Meanwhile, the factories are open all the time. Now, meanwhile, other things are starting to change. There were no laws protecting the rights of workers or giving fair wages. There's no minimum wage, nothing. No laws protecting children, no laws protecting women. Typically, men were paid a certain salary, women could be paid half of that, and children often were paid a quarter of that. There were no restrictions on what jobs people could do or at what age. Today, if any of you went out and got a job, you might be told, like, until you're 18, you can't work this piece of machinery, you can't touch this. When I used to work at Office Maxes in high school, I wasn't allowed to use the baler. Which, if you ever watched The Office, they make a lot of jokes on that about how the people aren't allowed to touch the baler. Because it's a dangerous piece of machinery. None of those laws existed. I mean, you see this picture here in this lower right-hand corner. This boy's not even wearing shoes. They're in a dirty factory. I mean, there's stuff all over the floors. They're working some kind of textile machinery here. I mean, these kids are maybe 10. I don't know. Probably younger than 10 on the outside. I mean, poor nutrition probably not helping as well either. He doesn't even have shoes. I mean, this is a ridiculous situation for anybody today, but this is the early industrial age. There were no laws and no protections. Crime always comes before the law. We had to have people realize that this was a crime. At first, nobody really realized or cared. And anyways, very unsafe working conditions. Factories were usually dark, dirty, and dangerous places. Children, anybody could have been hurt at any time. Children are oftentimes hired specifically because of their small hands. Their tiny hands allow them to reach into machinery and to do jobs that an adult hand would struggle to do. So let's say cotton got stuck into a machine, right? If little pieces of cotton got stuck into the machine, those tiny little hands could reach into the machine without stopping the machine. You don't want to slow production, right? So their tiny little hands could reach into the machine and pluck out the pieces of cotton. Well, what if you get a finger stuck? You make one false move because you're 7 and you haven't eaten and you're working a 14-hour day. Well, you lose your finger, you lose your hand. If you lose your job, there's no protections. There's no protection. You lose your hand, there's no protections. You're out on the street. They fire you because you can't do your job anymore. There's no workman's comp. There's no unemployment insurance. You're out. You're done. And that might be the end of your life. It's a pretty terrible time. As early industrial age is not a great time to be on the lowest rung of the social hierarchy. Let's talk about the impact of factory life. Women were usually the ones at first leaving homes to work in factories, although that's going to change. And obviously in America, we have a huge amount of immigration, so you're going to see men and women. But especially in the early days, it's typically women working in factories. They could be paid less than men. That's one of the big reasons why. Also, and this is terrible, but women were easier to control. Male supervisors would run the factories, or male factory owners. It was easier for them to discipline and punish and treat poorly adult men, somebody who is their size, and that's terrible, but that's the reality of it. They would hire women and children because they were easier to control. And keep in mind, controlling also meant like you could hit your employees back then. No restrictions on these things. Oftentimes, many factory floors would have a strap on it, basically a thick leather belt, which would be on a nail in the middle of the factory, and that was used to encourage their workers. It's a pretty horrendous time. But women would leave the factories. They could be paid less, or work in the factories, leave their home to work in the factories. They could be paid less than men, and they would do a lot of these early textile jobs, and eventually other jobs would follow suit as well too. That's going to have a huge impact on traditional family life. think about for most of history, the paterfamilias, right? The father of the family. Father ruled everything, but that's all going to change now. Women are out of their family's control, out of their parents' control, out of their father's control. And now women are going to have a lot more say. Women would have to leave their home and go work in factories that weren't just down the street. They'd oftentimes be tens, if not hundreds of miles away. And some people are leaving Europe eventually as America starts to industrialize to come work in American factories. You'd never see your family again. So who's in control of your life, right? Who's going to pick who you marry? For most of history, humans had arranged marriage. That was a very common thing. Your parents or a matchmaker in the village or town would pick who you were going to marry. Maybe for political reasons, maybe for economic reasons, but your spouse was usually chosen for you. Now, young men and women are going to start marrying for love and romance, and that's going to have an impact on culture and the romantic era, and why we get married. We see this change happen in the Western world. Now, countries and places of the world that did not industrialize, we never see this change, not until really recent history. So places in the Middle East and China and India, they're going to hold on to arranged marriage for much longer in history, whereas Western Europe and the United States of America drop it pretty early on because it was almost impossible to enforce. So many people today, we look at other societies who have arranged marriage and we look down upon it oftentimes. You got to understand that's the norm. That was the norm for most of human history. The traditional family life was the norm for that way. Arranged marriages. What we have today is a really recent change. Marrying for love and romance. Anyways, moving on to the next part. People moved into these crowded cities, and slums would start developing around the factory towns, around the factories. And you've probably heard the word slum before. It's not a place you want to live. Very disgusting. Crime, poverty, filth. There's a bunch of people in this picture. It's almost like one of those eye puzzles. You see these people here, they're sleeping sitting up against a wall. This over here is all of their clothing. You see their shoes over here. It's next to their wood-burning fireplace. And they're doing this to dry out their clothing and to keep it warm. Meanwhile, they're sleeping in this room. Please don't stack all your clothing above a wood-burning fireplace, but this is what they did in order to survive. No windows. It's pitch black dark, and this is where people would live. This is where the poorest of the poor, the factory workers, would spend their time when they weren't working incredibly long shifts. This picture was only possible because of the new technology of flash photography. You'll learn about this guy next year. Jacob Reese, I believe it was Jacob Reese. He was a crime scene photographer. He used flash, basically a pile of gunpowder on a pan. You would set it on fire. It would make a bright flash, and then you would take a picture using a camera, and it would have a bright flash of light so you can get pictures at night. He used it originally for crime scene photography, but then he started taking pictures of people's lives. He made a famous picture series called How the Other Half Lives. You'll learn about him a lot more next year in APUS, but these are some of his pictures here. These are some of the most famous ones. Children sleeping on the streets, no shoes, huddled together for warmth, people in rooms packed together like sardines in very unsafe, unsanitary conditions. Imagine disease spreading through these places. Thefts were common. A horrible, horrible way to live. So these poor working conditions, had a huge impact on our lives. Dramatic shift from working seasonally, working around your family. Well, now you're working for somebody else, and they don't care about you unless they can make money off of your labor. And that's really the early industrial age. People worked 6 days a week, 14-hour days, and that was a typical thing. You would have Sunday off. So Sunday, and not everybody had Sunday off, but Sunday was your day off typically because it was the day to go to church. But otherwise, you're working every other day of the week, and you're working 12 to 14-hour days. So, not ideal. Punishment was severe, and you had no recourse. You couldn't go to the police and complain about getting beat on the job because the police would side with the factory owner. They would side with the person who had money. Now, some people decided that this system was wrong, and pretty early on, early industrial age, there was a Luddite protest, a Luddite movement in England. It's based around this poem. I'm not going to read for you here, but it's about a poem by Ned Ludd. But the Luddites were basically peasants who said, I'm not going to do this. I don't want to be a part of this system. I don't want to be a part of this factory system. And so they decided that machines were destroying their traditional way of life, and so they wanted to destroy the machines. So the Luddites put on hoods and they went out and destroyed machinery. And at first they saw some popular support, as a lot of peasants and early people said, yeah, this is terrible. We shouldn't do these jobs. But people were in closure movement. They were getting kicked off their farms. There were too many people. People needed work, and so on and so forth. There was a need for people to have these factory jobs, but these jobs were terrible. And rather than push for you know labor reforms and stuff, that's going to come later. The Luddites said, no, let's just get rid of the machines. Let's destroy them all. And so they started destroying, taking axes and hammers and destroying factory machinery. The British government rounded them up, and 14 Luddites were hanged. That's pretty much the end of the Luddite movement. But also, it shows that there's a big support from the government in support of the machinery, in support of the factories and the factory owners, and not of the people. The early governments, and we're going to see this in America and England and everywhere else, the early governments are going to side with manufacturing and the industrial powers, and not with the working class, not with the people. And that's going to cause some problems later on, because these conditions are just going to get worse until the point where they hit a tipping point. So let's talk about early industrial age. This is just the very beginning of the industrial age. Industry, good and bad. Good, things were made quickly, which we're not naked, which is fantastic. And now we have the ability to make things way faster than ever before, and our material quality of life has skyrocketed. We live better post-industrial age. We live better than kings and queens did. You have more stuff than Julius Caesar. Now, you may not have as much power and authority over people's lives, but you have a lot more stuff. And that's the industrial age. We have more clothes than most people. You probably in your closet right now have more clothes than kings and queens did 2,000 years ago. And that's the industrial age. Supply increased, so we saw a massive supply of originally textiles, but then everything else, and as a result, prices fell, and now it's possible for people to own manufactured goods. Everybody can own clothing. Everybody can have stuff. Easier jobs. Now, instead of having a blacksmith and a tinsmith and a goldsmith and a gunsmith and people who were very specialized and did very specialized, hard to learn tasks, spend your entire life learning tasks, well, now a machine does all the hard part. All you have to do is make sure the machine works. That's going to be kind of good and bad, but the jobs are easier and anybody can do it, including women and children. So now also more women can work, and this means that women have options in life. For most of history, a woman's option was to get married and have children, and that was about it. Even if you were a queen, that was kind of still your main job. Women would take care of the home and all the domestic duties, but now women had an out. If you were a girl who didn't want to work on a farm and didn't just want to be a farmer's wife, you could run away from home and go work in a factory. Now, that may be a bad choice ultimately, but many women are going to make that choice rather than live controlled in one place. Another good thing for many people, a lot of inventors are going to become incredibly rich. During this time period, we see the growth of the United States economy. Some of the richest people to ever live, you've probably heard of before, they're going to become incredibly rich during this time period. So if you can come up with a new machine, a new technology that makes clothing faster, makes steel faster, you're going to become a multi-millionaire practically overnight. Bad. People had to leave homes to work in dirty factories, and that's not great. The factories were not ideal places to work, especially the early industrial age. Also, we talked here about easier labor. Well, that's also going to lead to a bad thing. Most people now are just watching machines work or helping the machines work. They're not doing the work themselves. It used to be that, and if you've ever made something, you've had this feeling. It used to be that when you made something, you had a connection with it. Like you took ownership of it. It was unique. It was an artisan type deal. Like you've made something. If you've ever created something, you've probably experienced that feeling in your life. Well, that's all gone now. Everything's the exact same, and all you're doing is watching a machine do the work. You could have spent your entire life being a skilled blacksmith or something, making horseshoes or making hinges, or a gunsmith making ornate guns. Well, now a machine's going to do all that work for you, and everything's going to be mass produced. You're going to get a lot more of it. It's going to be the exact same, but there's no heart in it. There's no connection to it anymore. You're not doing the work. You're not an artisan anymore. You're just basically making sure the machine does its job. It kind of removes the human factor of it, and that's kind of a sad change for human history. A lot of people, of course, too, a lot of these skilled laborers will be out of a job. Next bad thing, the cotton gin kept slavery profitable in the U.S. And once again, this is not APUS, that's more of an APUS topic, but I do want to make sure we touch on that a little bit. The cotton gin is attributed to the high growth of slavery in the United States of America. The industrial age gives us the cotton gin, and that's going to keep slavery very profitable. Many historians have pointed that out. That's where we'll stop for this one.